Welcome to Voices of the Valley, a captivating podcast series that brings together some of the brightest minds in the agriculture industry. Straight from the field to your living room, we explore the challenges, innovation, and triumphs in modern-day farming and provide insight for consumers who are curious about where their food comes from. Welcome to this episode of Voices of the Valley. I'm your host, Corey Lundy. You may have never given today's topic much consideration, but I can assure you, this is the episode you didn't know you needed. We are joined by CDFA entomologist Dr. Jason Leathers and K9 handler Michelle King as we delve into the exciting world of agricultural pest detection. They'll share why it's important travelers don't pack a pest and how we all can participate in protecting agriculture. We'll even get to meet the pest-sniffing K9 Kernul, an 8-year-old chocolate lab who helped protect California agriculture by using his nose to sniff out unwanted pests in unmarked packages. Let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Timmins, and I am from Western Growers.
And I'm Jeana Cadby. I'm from Western Growers.
Hi, and I'm Jason Leathers. I'm from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and I'm the branch chief of the Pest Detection and Emergency Projects branch. The goal of the Pest Detection and Emergency Projects branch is the early detection and quick and efficient eradication of any insect pest or plant diseases that come into California before it can become established and cause damage to agriculture or the environment.
So what makes California so special in terms of agriculture? And how does that play into the work that the CDFA does?
Agriculture in California is huge. We produce over half of the nation's fresh fruits and vegetables, and over 400 types of commodities. And it's a strategic resource that the nation relies on. We saw with the pandemic disruptions with supply chains that made it very difficult to get imported items. And so it's really critical for the strength of our nation to have this strategic resource available and available at an economic cost for consumers. California has a big advantage over a lot of other areas where we have geographic barriers that separate us from the rest of the nation and other countries. We have the Sierra Nevada mountains and the deserts along the east and the Klamath Mountains to the north. And so these create barriers that most pests cannot cross on their own. And so it gives us an advantage to keeping these things out of the state.
Talk a little bit about what it means to have these invasive fruit fly species in California. Why is it different than what we've seen before, and why is it different from maybe what people understand to be the fruit flies they see in their homes?
That's a great question. And it turns out there are two different groups of flies that we call fruit flies. And the one that most people are familiar with are the Drosophila, little tiny flies that you find in your kitchen around bananas, overripe fruit, and things like that. And these are not really agricultural pests. They don't get into crops when they're still in the orchards or groves. And then there's another group of fruit flies, the Tophritids, which are much larger. They're about the size of a housefly, and most of them are brightly colored. And they're a big problem for agriculture and home gardeners because they attack fruit while it's still on the tree before it's ripe. And this can cause growers to lose entire crops.
So how much damage could one little fruit fly cause, right? So if one gets into California, what are the impacts of that?
Yeah, so one fly by itself, if it's a mated female, can start laying eggs immediately under the skin of host fruit. And she'll typically lay 2 to 3 eggs under the skin of fruit. The eggs hatch into maggots, which tunnel through the fruit, rendering it unfit for consumption. And eventually the larvae will crawl out of the fruit and go into the soil to pupate, and then emerge as adult flies. And each fruit fly can lay hundreds of eggs herself. And the life cycle is typically, depending on the weather, something like 6 to 8 weeks. And so they can rapidly increase their numbers and become a huge population before you know it.
So California, we grow a lot of fruits and vegetables, and it seems like it would be a perfect place to have for fruit flies to thrive. So what is keeping them from coming in and setting up shop and just thriving in California?
So we have a multi-tiered approach to keep the fruit flies out of California. First of all, our regulations. All of the fruit coming in to be sold commercially in grocery stores either is treated before it gets here or is grown under a systems approach where the growers keep the fruit fly population very low or out of the groves where it comes from. And then we also have our border protection stations that monitor about something like 20 million private vehicles and 7 million commercial vehicles each year coming into California. We have 16 stations, 6 along the major highways coming in from Oregon and 10 along the borders to the east. And so these do a great job of keeping the fruit flies out, especially things like Caribbean fruit fly, which are established in part of the United States. We have dog teams that are inspecting parcels as they come into California at FedEx, UPS, and the post office. And these dogs are trained to detect plant volatiles and to mark or hit on any packages that have plant material and allow inspectors to check if there's any fruit coming in that might be infested.
So you mentioned we have here in California, fruit flies that already exist, fruit flies that you might see in your kitchen. So which ones are the bad guys here, the ones that are impacting agriculture?
Yeah, the biggest ones that we deal with historically are the oriental fruit fly, Bactrocera dorsalis, which comes into California almost every year since the 1960s. We have the Mediterranean fruit fly, which caused some huge problems back in the 80s and 90s. We had huge projects covering, most of the San Francisco Bay Area and a lot of Southern California. And we also get peach fruit fly, guava fruit fly, Mexican fruit fly, and a variety of other flies coming in each year.
So when you say huge projects, what is a project?
So a project is triggered whenever we find evidence of a breeding population of fruit flies in California. And typically, for most fruit flies, this is 2 flies. It's considered evidence of a breeding population. However, for flies where we have a really powerful lure to draw them in, such as the oriental fruit fly, the trigger is higher, 6 to 8 flies, depending on the situation. And whenever we trigger a project, that triggers a quarantine in a 4.5-mile radius around those detections, where we regulate the movement of host fruit out of the area to make sure the flies don't spread. And it'll also trigger a treatment project where we go in typically within a 1.5-mile radius and put out bait stations for the flies or conduct a sterile release.
So a lot of our growers remember a time when airplanes were flying over to address the fruit flies. Are we still doing that, or what are we doing differently now?
Yeah, we have not had any aerial treatments for fruit flies in California since the 1990s. What we do now is, like I mentioned before, is we rotate the traps to a new site every 6 to 8 weeks. And this allows us to find the populations where they're much smaller, typically within a 1-mile radius. And so there we can address the flies just from the ground with backpack sprays or with trucks.
So last season, there was an exceptionally high number of species that were identified in California. Can you talk a little bit about why that was and maybe some of the challenges that CDFA faced because of that?
2023 was a record-breaking year for exotic fruit flies in California, or invasive fruit flies as we like to call them now. We detected 948 flies, I believe, and the average is 75. It was a record-breaking year. We had the first quarantines for Queensland fruit fly and for a towel fruit fly in California. And the reason for this is there's sort of a rebound in travel after the pandemic where a lot more people are traveling now, and they're obviously bringing more fruit with them back when they do travel. There's a lot of people who are moved to shopping online and are buying produce online that's coming from illegal pathways, I would say, or unregulated sources. And so probably the combination of those two things really increased the pest risk last year. And consumers can have a huge impact on agriculture in California. Just bringing one piece of fruit back with you when you travel to Hawaii or Asia or Central America can be infested with larvae or eggs. And the eggs are just inserted under the skin of the host fruit. So if it looks fine, no one realizes there's a problem until they get back and it sits on their counter for a few days and starts to look rotten, and they throw it out, and that can introduce flies to the environment. And each time that happens, a quarantine project typically costs the state and USDA $1 to $2 million to eradicate, so it's huge impact. Fortunately, most of our projects are in urban areas and don't have a big impact on agriculture, but when they do overlap at the urban-rural interface, it can cause growers to lose their entire crops. And we've had that happen several times recently.
In California, we have over 400 crops, a lot of which are fruit crops, which are highly impacted by fruit flies. And what is the cost if it comes into, and I know it varies by region and the species of the fruit fly and the crop itself, but what happens if it gets into agriculture? What happens to those growers?
We have, unfortunately, a great example of that in California with the olive fruit fly, Bactrocera olei. It came into California around 1998, and we did not have any good lure for it or sterile insects to control it, and it spread within 10 years throughout the state. And before that happened, California produced about 11% of the world's table olives, And once the fly became established, almost all of that now has to be used for olive oil. And the cost to treat a grove, growers have to use weekly treatments to try to keep the flies out. And the product is expensive to use and the labor is expensive to apply. Just economically, it changed the entire olive industry in the state.
How do we balance eradication versus exclusion?
Yeah, exclusion is by far the best scenario. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And like I say, we have our dog teams that are working in the parcel facilities, checking for any parcels coming in that have plant material. We have our border stations, which are making sure that all of the vehicles coming into California are in compliance with regulations. They're not carrying any pest. And those two things cut down a lot of the pest risk. And we also recently have more of our pest exclusion staff going out in the field and checking markets that might be selling produce that's illegal, brought in illegally from another state or another nation, and confiscating things like that. We've also had the staff bust sort of illegal markets set up at residential properties where people are selling fruit out of a shed on their driveway and things like that. And it's all stuff that's been smuggled in. And we have found a lot of fruit fly larvae in that type of material.
So what should we be looking out for? What are the top pests that, when it comes to agriculture, that we're really concerned about?
Spotted lanternfly, as I mentioned, that's one that's becoming more and more of a threat to California as it expands back east. It's a large, spotted-looking insect that's pretty distinctive, and the public's going to play a crucial role in finding that, just because it is distinctive, and the state can't be everywhere checking everything. The fruit flies are the other big pest, of course.
Where do people find more information on how they can participate?
That's a great question. I would definitely check with CDFA's website, and also there's a ton of information online for spotted lanternfly through the state of Pennsylvania and the USDA.
So insects have a benefit of kind of shorter lifespans, larger quantities of eggs and offspring, which is a larger variety of evolution, and evolution on a more rapid scale. Does that level of evolution tell you something about the environment, or can you draw any conclusions based on that kind of expedited evolutionary pattern?
Yeah, like you say, insects are highly adaptable with a high reproductive rate and a lot of genetic variability, which gives them the ability to quickly colonize new things within a couple of years. And we saw that happen in the United States with the apple maggot, which fed on some native hawthorns, I believe. And once people came in and started planting apples, it was able to adapt to that crop. And I believe now it's considered a separate species maybe from what it was originally. I'm not sure about that. But that's particularly concerning with things like the cherry fruit flies. There are cherry fruit flies present in the United States. There's a western cherry fruit fly that's in the high elevation areas of California. And it's not a problem now to the cherry production, which is down on the valley floor, because it needs a certain amount of cold temperatures to emerge at the right time to hit the cherries. And so right now, only about 5% of the offspring will emerge at the right time to hit sweet cherries, which makes it impossible for the flies to colonize the valley. However, if someone brought in, a huge load of infested cherries, 5% is suddenly a big number, enough to probably colonize cherries and become a big problem in the valley.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about, that you wanted to shine some light on in terms of the work that you're doing, that the CDFA is doing, that you want consumers to know?
Yes, definitely. We really need the consumers to help us out. Mainly we have the message, don't pack a pest. When people travel to another country or another state, don't bring fruit back with them, especially if it's backyard fruit, or from any other country, anything can be infested with fruit flies or other pests. So don't bring any fruit or other agricultural materials with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We learned a lot about the importance that we all have in the food supply chain and what we can do as consumers to protect the food that we rely so much upon. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kara Timmins. I am from Western Growers.
And I'm Jeana Cadby from Western Growers.
And I'm Michelle King with Sacramento County Department of Agriculture. I'm a K9 handler with K9 pest detection dog, Kernul.
We're standing here in a warehouse and we're surrounded by boxes. It kind of looks like a packaging facility or some sort of FedEx or post office. Can you talk a little bit about where we are and what we're doing here today?
This is a mock post office setup. So we go around with our labs and to all these different facilities inside our county or outside of our county to find pests that are not in a marked box. So he uses his nose to find these pests that we can't see. Most packages that come with flowers or fruit from a reputable company are marked. They're labeled appropriately according to USDA regulations or California state regulations or the Department of Agriculture's county regulations. If we see them, then we inspect them. But when we don't see them, the dog's nose knows. And he's able to scent it out and pick out those packages that we cannot see. So that's the whole point and purpose of him. And that's where we find the best stuff.
Program-wide, how often are the dogs detecting fruits and vegetables that people are shipping?
Pretty much on a daily basis, especially during the summertime when it's peak season. If we're out in the field, we find something, no matter what. And I would say at a regular facility during this time of the year, we're going to alert on at least 100 and something packages, which maybe 10% might have an unmarked box and pests on it. As a statewide, I think we have found, if we put the numbers together in an annual year, there's over 1,000 different fines, pest fines, be it invasive species of insect or weeds, a plant disease or pathogen. Just you never know what you're going to find, or an animal, invasive animals. So there's a lot of weird stuff out there people are shipping.
So Kernul is obviously very handsome. And what kind of dog is he? How did he get picked, and what does that training process look like?
Kernul is a Labrador Retriever. He is chocolate colored. He's beautiful, absolutely. He's very friendly and he's eager to work. He is 8.5 years old. He got picked because, well, what happens is the USDA or United States Department of Agriculture goes around the country to different shelters or what they call vendors. A vendor is somebody who picks dogs up from shelters for USDA because they know that these dogs are going to do good with USDA and they'll take them. So USDA flies across the country, around the country, looking at different shelters and vendors for these animals. And the way they choose them is they profile them by looks, for one, depending on what program they're going into. So if it's state of California or state of Florida, they'll pick a lab because these labs are going to facilities that are close with people. We don't want these animals to look scary. We want them to be friendly. We want the people that we're working with to find us friendly and accept us. The other way they become profiled is by their drive for treats, because that's how they're paid. If they don't want treats, they don't pick them. So one of the trainers in Georgia said that she goes down the aisle and takes a handful of treats and throws it in the cage and into the kennel. And if the dog goes for it, she's like, we'll take that one. If the dog doesn't, then they're like, nope, sorry. So Kernul was a winner. He was picked up in the state of Washington, flown to Georgia for the training. It's the National Dog Detector Training Center in Georgia, Newnan, Georgia. And I don't know how long the dogs actually train with the trainers before we get there. I think it depends on the dog, but they do train them on 5 scents. It's citrus, stone fruits, guava, mango, and apples. That's their 5 basic training targets.
How many smells is Kernul trained on?
Oh, goodness. He is originally trained on 5, but as time goes on, he has learned to figure things out himself. With that said, we do a monthly training, and we do trainings just him and I solo after he comes back from Georgia to help increase the amount of scents that he can find. So we'll start adding plants, or we'll start adding a type of vegetable or some other fruit or a tree or just soil. And then he has slowly been able to figure out more stuff. He can find insects on his own. He'll find a seed packet this big in a big giant bin from the post office. He's just learned how to do it. I mean, I think there's something in common. There's got to be like an earth earthy smell or a live smell, that it's the key component for them.
What is the process after Kernul detects a package from the sender's perspective? Do they get a letter? Do they get some kind of notification, or is the package just taken out of circulation?
That depends on the package. So, for example, if a package that is not marked with fruit, that is not in a quarantine area of Southern California, comes to us, we inspect it and release it if it's clean. If it's something that comes from Florida that's not marked and there's fruit in it, it's an automatic, sorry, it's destroyed because you don't have Caribbean fruit fly certifications and treatment that's proving that. If they can prove that they do have that, which most of them, if their box isn't marked, cannot prove that because they don't know. It's usually somebody picking it off their tree in the backyard saying, oh, I didn't know. Then we destroy their package and we send them a letter. I mean, that's pretty much it. There's no fine with it, but it's just more of a information like, hey, you can't do this.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's Voices of the Valley. Today's episode was produced by Timmins and Michelle Rivera. We'd like to give a huge thanks to Jason Leathers, Michelle King, and our new four-legged friend, Kernul, for joining us this week. In our next episode of Voices of the Valley, we'll be talking to Abby Taylor Silva, Executive Vice President of the California Agricultural Leadership Foundation. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Find and follow us on X at our handle @WesternGrowers. You can also find us on Instagram at Western_growers. We'll be selecting a few lucky recipients to receive a coveted Western Growers branded Stanley mug. That wraps up this week's Voices of the Valley. I'm Corey Lundy, signing off. Thanks for tuning in to Voices of the Valley, a Western Growers production. Produced by Corey Lundy, Ann Donahue, Michelle Rivera, Kara Timmins, and Julia Nellis. As always, we'd like to give a special shout out to our guest for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch our future episodes, and we invite you to follow us on social media to continue the conversation.